The house was quiet, wrapped in the thick silence that only settles in the dead of night, the kind where every small sound feels louder than it should. I had thought I was alone, that no one would be awake at this hour, but I was wrong. The soft creak of my bedroom door barely registered at first. It was subtle, almost hesitant, like someone wasn't sure if they should enter or turn back. But the moment I looked up, my heart nearly stopped. Standing in the dim light of the doorway was my stepson, his expression frozen somewhere between shock and confusion. For a second, neither of us spoke. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, stretching time unbearably thin. I could see the flicker of emotions running through his face. Surprise, curiosity, maybe even something else he didn't fully understand himself. And me? My mind raced with a million thoughts, but not a single one formed into words. This wasn't supposed to happen. I had been so careful. The house was supposed to be asleep, but here he was, wide awake, staring at me in a way that made my pulse pound. Uh, I, he started, but his voice trailed off, like he wasn't sure what to say next. I swallowed hard, quickly trying to regain my composure. "What are you doing up?" I asked, my voice coming out steadier than I felt inside. He hesitated, shifting on his feet. I heard something. Thought maybe. His sentence faded into silence, his eyes still locked on me, still trying to process what he had just walked in on. I took a deep breath, trying to decide how to handle this. But before I could say anything else, he did something that completely threw me off guard, something I never saw coming. And in that moment, I knew this night wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. His eyes darted between me and the dimly lit room, his expression still unreadable. I could tell he was trying to figure out what to say, how to react. But the longer he stood there, the heavier the air between us became. I shifted slightly, suddenly feeling exposed, not just physically, but in a way that made my chest tighten. He cleared his throat, breaking the silence. I, I didn't mean to barge in, he muttered, taking a small step back. I just thought I heard something, thought maybe something was wrong. Something was wrong, but not in the way he was thinking. I forced a small, shaky breath and nodded. No, it's fine. You just caught me off guard, that's all. My voice was calm, but inside, my thoughts were anything but. How much had he seen? What was he thinking? Was he going to say anything? He hesitated again, his hand still gripping the edge of the door frame. He was usually confident, always knowing exactly what to say, but right now, he looked just as lost as I felt. "I guess I should go back to bed," he said slowly. But there was something in his tone, something that told me he wasn't entirely convinced that was the right thing to do. I nodded, maybe a little too quickly. "Yeah, it's late." For a moment, he didn't move. He just stood there, studying me in a way that made my stomach twist. Then finally, he took a small step back, his fingers slipping off the door frame. "Good night," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Good night," I replied, though my heart was still racing. I watched as he turned and walked away, his footsteps barely making a sound as he disappeared down the hall. The moment he was out of sight, I exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to my forehead. What just happened? This was bad, really bad. I needed to figure out what he was thinking, if he would tell anyone, if this would change things between us. And the worst part? I had a feeling this wasn't the last time we'd have a moment like this. The rest of the night passed in a blur, but sleep never came. I kept replaying the moment over and over, searching for something, anything, that might tell me what he was thinking. But no matter how many times I ran through it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Morning came too soon, and as I stepped into the kitchen, The air felt different. He was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee in front of him, but he wasn't drinking it. He was just staring at it, lost in thought. For a second, I considered turning around, pretending I hadn't seen him, but it was too late. He glanced up, and our eyes met. There it was again, that unreadable expression, the same one from last night. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice light, casual. "Morning," he replied, his tone careful. I moved toward the coffee maker, feeling his eyes on me. He was waiting for me to say something, but I didn't know what. Should I act like nothing happened? Should I bring it up? The silence stretched between us, thick and unspoken. I finally turned around, leaning against the counter as I took a slow sip of coffee. "You slept okay?" His fingers tapped against the mug, a small, restless movement. "Yeah. You?" I hesitated. "Not really." That got his attention. He lifted his gaze, studying me again. "Because of last night?" There it was, the conversation I wasn't sure I was ready to have. I could either brush it off or acknowledge it. Either way, it wouldn't change the fact that something had happened, and we both knew it. I set my mug down, exhaling softly. "Look, I don't know what you're thinking, but I'm not thinking anything," he interrupted, but the way he said it made me think otherwise. I frowned slightly. "You sure about that?" He held my gaze for a moment before looking away. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I just didn't expect it." Neither did I. The weight of unspoken words filled the space between us, and I realized this wasn't something that would just go away. Whatever had started last night, it wasn't over, and something told me it was only going to get more complicated from here. The next few days passed in a strange haze. Conversations felt different. Moments that once felt normal now carried an unspoken weight. Every time we crossed paths, there was a hesitation, a pause, like we were both waiting for the other to bring up what had happened. But neither of us did. It wasn't until one evening, when the house was quiet again, that the tension finally reached its breaking point. I had been in my room, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been following me all day. Then came the knock. Soft at first, like he wasn't sure if he should do it. But when I didn't answer right away, there was another, firmer this time. I hesitated before getting up and opening the door. And there he was, standing in the dim light of the hallway, looking like he had something to say, but wasn't sure how to start. "Can I come in?" His voice was quieter than usual, careful. A beat of silence passed before I stepped aside, letting him in. He walked in slowly, glancing around like he was seeing the room differently now. Maybe he was. I shut the door behind him. "What's on your mind?" I asked, keeping my tone even. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I just, I need to ask you something." I waited. "That night," he said finally, his voice low, Did I make things weird?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't what I had been expecting. I studied him for a moment, trying to read what was really going through his mind. "No," I said carefully. "But something changed, didn't it?" He swallowed hard, nodding slightly. "Yeah, and I don't know what to do with that." The weight of his words settled between us, heavy and unspoken. I took a slow breath, choosing my next words carefully. "I think we both need to figure that out." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw it. The moment everything was leading up to. The moment where things would either come crashing down or change forever. The silence in the room stretched, thick with something unspoken. His eyes were locked on mine, and for a second, I felt like we were both standing on the edge of something neither of us knew how to handle. I had thought this conversation was coming to an end, but then he said something that shifted everything. I wasn't the only one awake that night. The words hit me like a slow-moving storm, creeping in with a weight that settled deep in my chest. My breath caught, and my mind raced to catch up. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quieter than before. He hesitated, like he was debating whether to say it at all. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath. "Someone else saw too." A chill ran through me. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. "Who?" His jaw tightened, his gaze flickering toward the door for a brief second before coming back to me. "I don't know for sure," he admitted. "But I have a feeling." This was bad. Worse than I had imagined. One moment I had thought we were dealing with something private, something just between us. Now there was someone else, someone who knew. I took a step back, running a hand through my hair. "Did they say anything to you?" "No." He shook his head, but the uncertainty in his voice sent another wave of unease through me. "But I caught something weird yesterday. I was coming down the stairs, and I swear I heard someone mention it. Like, they were talking in hushed voices, like they weren't supposed to be saying anything." My stomach twisted. If someone had seen and was already talking, that meant things could spiral out of control fast. "Did you hear what they said exactly?" He hesitated, thinking back. Something about being surprised, about not expecting it, but it was vague, like they weren't sure what to make of it either. My mind went into overdrive. Who else had been awake that late? Who could have possibly seen? And more importantly, what were they planning to do with that information? "We need to figure out who it was," I said, my voice steady despite the knot tightening in my chest. "Before this gets out of our hands." He nodded, but I could see the concern in his eyes. "Yeah, but what if they already told someone?" That thought alone sent a fresh wave of dread through me. If this had already started to spread, there was no telling what could happen next. The air between us felt heavier than ever. There was no going back to how things were before that night. And now the real question wasn't just what happened between us, it was who else knew and what they were planning to do with the truth. The next day felt like walking on a tightrope, every moment teetering between control and complete disaster. I went through the motions, but my mind kept circling back to one thing. Who else knew, and what were they planning to do with it? By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted from pretending everything was fine. But just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my stepson walked into the room, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. "I found out who saw," he said, his voice low. My stomach tightened. "Who?" He hesitated, then looked me dead in the eye. "It was her." The name didn't need to be spoken. I felt the weight of it immediately. Of all the people who could have known, it had to be her. Someone who wouldn't just let it go, someone who would use it. I felt a rush of cold panic. "What did she say?" "She hasn't told anyone, yet." His jaw tensed. "But she wants to talk. She told me to meet her tonight." A thousand thoughts rushed through my head. This wasn't just about what happened that night anymore. This was bigger. If she had seen, if she had proof, she could do anything with it. "I'm going with you," I said firmly. He shook his head. "Number she said she'd only talk to me." I didn't like this, not one bit, but there wasn't a choice. This had to end tonight. Hours later, I waited outside, the night air thick with tension as he stepped into the meeting spot. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I saw the way she moved, calm, confident, too confident. She had something she thought gave her the upper hand. Then, suddenly, his body language shifted. His shoulders straightened. And then he said something, just a few words. But whatever they were, they hit her hard. I saw the way her expression changed, the confidence flickering into uncertainty. A minute later, she turned and walked away. He came back to me, his face unreadable. "What happened?" I demanded. He exhaled. "I called her bluff." I frowned. Meaning? She didn't see as much as she thought, and she had no proof. He smirked, but there was something else in his eyes, something darker. So I reminded her that she had just as much to lose. A chill ran through me. It was over. Or at least, that's what I thought, until my phone buzzed in my pocket. A new message from an unknown number. I know everything. My hands tightened around my phone as I stared at the message. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely think. I know everything. The words glared back at me, a stark reminder that this wasn't over, that no matter how much we thought we had taken control, there was still someone out there, someone watching, someone waiting. He must have noticed the shift in my expression because his smirk faded. "What's wrong?" Wordlessly, I turned the phone toward him. His eyes flickered over the message, and I saw his jaw clench. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. She backed off. Who else could? But then he stopped, realization dawning on him just as it did for me. The answer had been in front of us the whole time. There had always been someone else awake that night, someone we hadn't even considered. A slow chill crept through me as I pieced it together. "Do you think they'll say anything?" I asked, my voice quieter now. His lips pressed into a thin line. "They haven't yet. If they wanted to, they would have done it already." That should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. The message wasn't a threat. It wasn't a demand. It was a reminder, a warning that we weren't the only ones holding secrets. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything hung in the air between us, unspoken but understood. This wasn't something we could erase. It would always be there, lingering in the background, waiting to surface again when we least expected it. Finally, I let out a slow breath, slipping my phone back into my pocket. Then we moved forward. His gaze stayed on me, searching for something, before he finally nodded. Yeah, we moved forward. It wasn't the clean resolution I had hoped for. There were still unanswered questions, lingering doubts. But some things weren't meant to have perfect endings. Some things just had to be lived with. As we stepped away from that moment, I knew one thing for sure. The past had a way of staying with you, and no matter how deep you buried it, some secrets refused to stay hidden forever.